My father stood in front of 70 guests at my mother's funeral reception and raised his glass. Instead of honoring her memory, he pointed his finger at me and announced to the entire room that I was the only mistake my mother ever made. He dropped a thick legal petition on the table, moving to strip me of my inheritance on the grounds that I was an illegitimate child. He thought I would run away crying. He forgot that I am a forensic accountant who destroys liars for a living. The DNA test I forced him to take that afternoon did not just prove him wrong. It unearthed a horrifying 35-year-old secret that cost him absolutely everything. My name is Rochelle, and I am 35 years old. If you have ever been the scapegoat in your own family, you know exactly how heavy that burden is. Before I tell you how I dismantled my father's empire piece by piece, let me know what city you are watching from down in the comments. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe the truth always comes to light. Now let me take you back to the day my family tried to bury me. The chandeliers in the Ritz-Carlton reception hall cast a cold light over the attendees. We had just buried my mother Clarice. The air was heavy with the smell of white lilies, expensive perfume, and the quiet murmurs of my parents' wealthy friends. I stood near the back of the room holding a glass of sparkling water, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. My mother and I had a complicated relationship built entirely on the impossible standards my father Richard set for us. Suddenly, the clinking of a silver spoon against crystal cut through the room. Richard stood at the head of the main table. The room fell dead silent. He looked around with his chest puffed out, playing the role of the tragic widower perfectly. He spoke about my mother with glowing words, calling her a saint, a pillar of the community, a woman of flawless character. Then his eyes locked onto mine. His expression hardened into pure disgust. He told the crowd that Clarice made only one mistake in her entire 35 years of marriage, and that mistake was standing right by the door. He pointed straight at me. A collective gasp rippled through the 70 guests. My stomach plummeted, but I kept my posture completely straight. Richard reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slammed them onto the polished mahogany table. He declared loud enough for the catering staff to hear that this was a legal petition to remove me from the family trust immediately. His grounds for removal were illegitimacy. He claimed I was the product of an affair my mother had hidden a bastard child who had leached off his hard-earned wealth for over 3 decades. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his lie, my younger sister Jasmine stepped forward to stand by his side. Jasmine had always been the golden child. She was wearing a custom black designer morning dress that I knew for a fact she had charged to my platinum credit card just 2 days ago. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smirk masking her venom. She placed a comforting hand on Richard's shoulder and told the crowd that it was truly tragic how our mother had been coerced into raising a child from another man, but she was so proud of her father for finally cleaning house. The absolute cruelty of her words echoed in the silent hall. My own family was using my mother's funeral to stage a public execution of my character. They expected a breakdown. They expected me to run out of the double doors in tears, surrendering my dignity and my legal rights. But I do not cry when I am challenged. I gather data. I walked slowly toward the front of the room, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I reached the mahogany table, looked Richard dead in the eye, and opened my leather handbag. I pulled out a sealed medical-grade DNA swab kit. I always keep one in my audit bag for corporate fraud cases involving disputed successions. I tore open the plastic wrapper, pulled out the sterile swab, and scraped it firmly against the inside of my cheek, right there in front of the entire country club elite. I sealed my vial, placed it on the table next to his ridiculous lawsuit, and pulled out the second swab. I told Richard to do the same. I challenged him to provide his sample right there in front of his board members, his golf buddies, and his family. I warned him that if he refused, my legal team would freeze the entire estate by tomorrow morning, pending a court-mandated paternity test. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Richard was cornered by his own massive ego. He could not back down now without looking like a coward to the men he wanted to impress. His face flushed a deep, angry purple. He snatched the swab from my hand, aggressively rubbed it inside his mouth, and shoved it into the plastic tube. He practically threw it at my chest. He raised his voice so everyone could hear, betting his entire controlling share of the company that I did not have a single drop of his blood in my veins. I simply smiled, placed the vials back in my bag, and promised him I would hold him to that wager. I left the reception holding my head high. I drove straight to an expedited testing laboratory I frequently use for my forensic investigations. I paid an exorbitant fee to rush the processing. For 2 days, I sat in my quiet apartment, ignoring the frantic texts from Jasmine, demanding I hand over my credit cards, and the threatening emails from Richard's lawyers. I knew who I was. I just needed the paper to prove it. On Tuesday morning, the email notification chimed on my laptop. The subject line read, "Confidential genetic screening results." My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the PDF attachment. I scrolled down to the first page. The numbers stared back at me in stark black and white. The probability of paternity was 99.9%. Richard was absolutely, undeniably my biological father. A wave of vindication washed over me. I had him. He was going to lose his company shares and his pride. But then I scrolled down to the second page. This page contained the mitochondrial DNA analysis, comparing my genetic markers against the detailed medical records we had on file for my mother Clarice. I stopped breathing. The screen blurred. I blinked hard and read the summary again. 0% maternal match. Clarice was not my biological mother. The room spun around me. If Richard was my father but Clarice was not my mother, then Clarice never cheated. Richard did. My mother had spent 35 years raising a child she believed was her own shameful mistake. Somehow his affair child had been handed to his wife to raise as a bastard. He had gaslit her, abused her emotionally, and turned me into the family scapegoat to cover up his own disgusting betrayal. And now I had the proof. The silence in the reception hall was absolute. Every single person in the room was staring at me, waiting to see how the illegitimate outcast would react to being publicly disowned at her own mother's funeral. Jasmine stood next to Richard with a triumphant smirk, convinced that her cruel words had finally broken me. They fully expected me to burst into tears, drop my purse, and run out of the Ritz-Carlton in complete disgrace. They wanted a dramatic retreat so they could spend the rest of the afternoon whispering about my instability. But I did not give them the satisfaction of a single tear. I did not break my posture, and I certainly did not look away. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my entire professional life tearing apart financial illusions, tracing hidden offshore assets, and unmasking corporate liars. I do not deal in emotional outbursts or family drama. I deal in absolute, undeniable proof. When someone presents me with a discrepancy, I conduct an audit. And my father had just handed me the biggest discrepancy of my life. I took a slow, deliberate breath and stepped away from the back wall. I walked straight down the center of the room toward the heavy mahogany table where Richard had thrown his legal petition. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the massive room like a ticking clock. The wealthy guests, the board members, and the country club elite hastily parted ways to let me through. They looked terrified, as if my sudden calm was more dangerous than a screaming fit. And they were right. I reached the table and stopped just inches away from Richard. His arrogant expression faltered for a fraction of a second. He was not used to anyone standing up to him, let alone the daughter he had treated like garbage for 35 years. Jasmine shifted nervously, her hand tightening on her husband Dion's arm. I maintained eye contact with Richard as I reached into my leather work bag. Right next to my audit files and my laptop was a sealed medical-grade DNA swab kit. I always keep one in my bag for high-stakes corporate succession cases because you would be amazed how often wealthy men lie about their bloodlines. I pulled the sterile white envelope out and held it up high so every single person in the room could see exactly what it was. I told Richard that if he wanted to make sweeping legal claims about my legitimacy to the estate, we were not going to rely on his dramatic little speeches. We were going to rely on science. I tore the plastic wrapper open with a loud, sharp rip. I pulled out the first sterile swab, opened my mouth, and scraped the cotton firmly against the inside of my cheek. I did it right there in front of the 70 horrified guests. I took my time ensuring I had a perfect sample. Then I snapped the plastic stem, dropped it into the secure vial, and locked the cap in place. I slammed my vial down onto the table, placing it dead center on top of his ridiculous disinheritance petition. Then I reached into the package and pulled out the second swab. I held it out toward him. I raised my voice, ensuring my tone was perfectly even and loud enough to reach the catering staff by the kitchen doors. I challenged him to take the test. I told him to swab his cheek right now in front of his peers, his business partners, and the family he claimed to be protecting. Jasmine immediately stepped forward, her voice shrill and panicked. She told me I was being completely psychotic and disrespectful to our mother's memory. Dion puffed out his chest and took a step toward me, telling me I needed to leave before he had security throw me out. I did not even look at them. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Richard. I told Richard that he had a choice. He could take the swab right now and prove his bold accusations to the world. Or if he refused, I would call my legal team the moment I walked out of this building. I promised him I would file a massive injunction by 9 o'clock the next morning. I would legally freeze the entire family estate, halt all of his company's financial operations, and lock down every single trust fund pending a court-mandated paternity test. I told him he would not be able to spend a single dime of my mother's money until a judge forced him to submit his DNA. The room erupted into frantic whispers. The board of directors exchanged highly alarmed glances. The threat of frozen corporate assets was enough to make them sweat. Richard's wealthy friends were watching him with intense scrutiny. His massive ego had effectively trapped him. If he backed down now and refused the test, he would look like a cowardly liar in front of the exact people he spent his entire life trying to dominate. He could not afford to lose face, and I knew it. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his custom silk tie. He snatched the sterile swab from my hand with so much aggressive force that he nearly snapped the plastic handle. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred and violently rubbed the cotton inside his mouth. He pulled it out, shoved it into the second vial, and practically threw it at my chest. He laughed loudly, a booming and arrogant sound designed to reassure his audience. He pointed a thick finger directly at my face. He yelled that I was nothing but a manipulative fraud who was desperately trying to steal from her betters. He announced to the entire room that he was willing to bet his controlling shares of the family company that I did not share a single drop of his blood. He promised that when the laboratory results came back, he would not only permanently disinherit me, but he would sue me for every single penny of resources I had drained from him over the last 35 years. I caught the vial perfectly in my hand. I looked at the label, double-checking that the seal was secure. I looked back up at his red, furious face and smiled calmly. I told him I would hold him to that exact wager. I placed both vials carefully into the protective case and slid them back into my leather bag. I zipped it shut with a definitive sound that echoed in the quiet room. I turned my back on my father, my sister, and the entire toxic legacy they represented. I walked out of the reception hall with my head held high, my heels clicking all the way to the exit. I left them standing in the ashes of their own ruined spectacle. Richard thought he had finally won. He had absolutely no idea he had just willingly handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his entire life. I did not go home after walking out of the reception hall. I drove straight across town to an independent, highly secure genetic testing laboratory that I regularly used for my corporate fraud investigations. I walked up to the counter, handed the technician the sealed protective case containing both vials, and paid an extra $2,000 out of my own pocket for the fastest turnaround time they legally offered. The technician assured me I would have the full certified report in my inbox within 48 hours. Those 2 days were a masterclass in psychological warfare from my family. They realized I was not bluffing and panic began to set in. My phone screen lit up constantly with notifications. Jasmine sent me dozens of text messages calling me a delusional psychopath for ruining our mother's funeral and demanding that I hand over my corporate credit cards immediately. Her husband Dion left 3 aggressive voicemails threatening to call the police and file a restraining order against me for harassing an elderly widower. On Monday afternoon, Richard's legal team even sent a private courier to my apartment complex to serve me with the official disinheritance papers. It was a blatant intimidation tactic designed to make me drop the DNA test and walk away empty-handed. I ignored every single message. I did not block them because, as a forensic accountant, I know that panicked people always leave a trail of evidence when they lose control. I simply put my phone on silent, brewed a pot of black coffee, and spent the weekend organizing my financial audit files. I let the cold, hard numbers ground me while I waited for the ultimate proof. On Tuesday morning, I was sitting at my kitchen island when the email notification finally chimed. The subject line read, "Confidential genetic screening results." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were completely steady as I clicked the encrypted PDF file. I entered my password, and the document opened on my screen. I scrolled past the medical jargon and went straight to the first page, which detailed the paternal comparison. The genetic markers lined up in a neat, undeniable row. At the bottom of the page, the final conclusion was printed in bold black letters. Probability of paternity was 99.9%. Richard was my biological father. A massive wave of vindication washed over me. He had lost his arrogant wager. He had lost his controlling shares of the company. Most importantly, he had completely lost his legal standing to remove me from my mother's trust on the grounds of illegitimacy. I had the absolute proof I needed to walk right back into his life and destroy his carefully crafted image. But I had ordered a comprehensive panel, not just a simple paternity check. Because I wanted to establish my full legal rights to the estate, I had instructed the lab to also test my mitochondrial DNA against the extensive medical records we had on file for my mother Clarice from her recent hospital treatments. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of unease, and scrolled down to the second page of the report. I stared at the screen. The numbers made absolutely no sense. I blinked hard, wiped my eyes, and read the summary paragraph again. 0% maternal match. No shared genetic markers. Clarice was not my biological mother. I pushed my chair back so fast it scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The walls of my kitchen felt like they were closing in on me. I read the conclusion a third time, but the science did not change. If Richard was my biological father, but Clarice was not my biological mother, then the entire narrative of my existence was a fabricated nightmare. Clarice had never cheated. She had never brought a child from another man into their marriage. The person who cheated was Richard. My mind raced back through 35 years of memories. I remembered the way Clarice used to look at me when she thought I was not paying attention. Her eyes always held a heartbreaking mixture of deep sadness, resentment, and profound guilt. Richard had spent my entire life loudly complaining that I looked nothing like Clarice's side of the family. He used my physical appearance to constantly remind her of her supposed infidelity. He treated me like a burden, and he manipulated Clarice into believing that she deserved his coldness because she had betrayed him. The horrifying truth hit me with the force of a freight train. Richard had an affair. His mistress had given birth to me. And through some sick, unimaginable manipulation, he had managed to place his own illegitimate baby into his wealthy wife's arms. Clarice came from generational wealth, and Richard had married into her money. If he had been caught with a mistress and a bastard child, Clarice would have divorced him and left him completely ruined. So instead of facing the consequences, he twisted reality. He convinced the woman he supposedly loved that she was the one who had committed a sin she could not even remember. He turned me into the physical evidence of her imaginary guilt, effectively breaking her spirit, so he could maintain absolute control over her inherited fortune. Richard thought my swab challenge at the funeral was just a desperate attempt to prove my mother's innocence. He was so arrogant, so blinded by his own narcissism, that he never stopped to consider that modern genetic testing would expose his own monstrous betrayal. I did not cry for myself. I cried out of pure white-hot rage for the woman who had spent 3 decades apologizing for a crime she never committed. I wiped my face, walked over to my printer, and hit the print button. The machine whirred to life, spitting out the crisp white pages that held Richard's death sentence. I slid the documents into a thick manila folder and grabbed my car keys from the counter. Richard had a massive executive board meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock this morning at his corporate headquarters. He was expecting to finalize his takeover of my mother's assets. Instead, he was about to get a visit from his only biological daughter. I pulled into the underground parking garage of Richard's corporate headquarters just before 10 o'clock in the morning. I bypassed the front reception desk entirely. Having worked as an external auditor for this very company a few years prior, I knew this building like the back of my hand. I stepped into the private executive elevator, swiped an old access card I knew they had forgotten to deactivate, and pressed the button for the top floor. My heart was completely calm. The initial shock from my apartment had crystallized into something cold and razor-sharp. I was no longer a grieving daughter. I was an auditor holding the ultimate proof of fraud. The executive floor was quiet, lined with plush carpets and expensive modern art. Richard's personal assistant jumped up from her desk when she saw me approaching, stammering that I could not go in there because a highly confidential meeting was taking place. I did not even break my stride. I walked right past her. The heavy frosted glass doors of the main boardroom were closed. Inside, 12 of the most powerful board members, legal advisors, and majority shareholders were gathered around a massive rectangular glass table. Richard sat at the head in a custom-tailored navy suit. He was pointing at a digital projection screen that displayed the legal restructuring of my mother's estate. He was actively showing his board how he planned to absorb Clarice's massive trust fund into the company's operating capital by legally erasing me from the family tree. I pushed both glass doors open with enough force that they banged loudly against the wall stoppers. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Every single head in the room snapped in my direction. The presentation clicker slipped from Richard's hand and clattered onto the desk. He stood up immediately, his face flushing with immediate anger. He slammed his hands flat on the glass table and demanded to know how I got past security. He pointed a finger at me, ordering me to leave the premises before he had the police drag me out for corporate trespassing. I ignored his threats completely. I walked the entire length of the boardroom. The silence in the room was deafening. The wealthy men and women who had watched him humiliate me at the funeral reception just days ago now watched me march toward him with absolute authority. They looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting in their expensive leather chairs. I reached the head of the table and stopped right beside him. I opened the thick manila folder I had brought with me. I pulled out the crisp white pages of the certified DNA laboratory report and slapped them face up on the glass, sliding them directly into his hands. I spoke loud enough for every single executive in the room to hear. I reminded him that at my mother's funeral, he had publicly wagered his controlling shares of this company that I did not have a single drop of his blood. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he lost the bet. Richard's face twisted into a mask of arrogant disbelief. He snatched the paper from the table, clearly ready to mock whatever I had brought him. He scoffed loudly, attempting to perform for the board members. But as his eyes scanned the official laboratory letterhead, the certified legal stamps, and the bold text confirming a 99.9% probability of paternity, the performance shattered. The color completely drained from his face. His skin turned a sickly ashen gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at the page, his hands beginning to tremble slightly. The board members exchanged highly alarmed looks. One of the senior legal partners leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, and asked Richard what the document said. Richard tried to shove the paper back into the manila folder to hide it, but I slammed my hand down hard on top of his wrist, pinning the document to the table. I told him to keep reading. I instructed him to flip to the second page. I turned my attention to the executives who respected this man. I announced to the entire boardroom that my father was actually right about one thing at the funeral. I was an illegitimate child, but my mother Clarice was not the one who had the affair. I pointed directly at Richard's trembling face and stated that the second page of that genetic screening proved unequivocally that I had zero maternal DNA match with his late wife. A collective gasp echoed through the boardroom. The senior partner stood up from his chair looking absolutely horrified. Richard collapsed back into his leather executive chair as if the wind had been violently knocked out of his lungs. He looked at me with wild, panicked eyes. The powerful, commanding CEO from the funeral was completely gone, replaced by a terrified fraud who had just been caught in a lie spanning 3 decades. I leaned over the glass table, getting right into his personal space, so he could not look away from me. I demanded to know the truth right then and there. I demanded to know exactly how his mistress's baby ended up in his wealthy wife's arms. I asked him how much money he paid to switch the medical records at the hospital and how he could possibly look my mother in the eye for 35 years while blaming her for a betrayal he committed. He tried to stammer out a denial, shaking his head and whispering that the test was forged, that I was making it up. But his voice was weak, pathetic, and entirely unconvincing. The board members were staring at him with mounting disgust. The digital projection of my mother's estate behind him suddenly looked less like a corporate strategy and exactly like what it truly was: a massive, calculated theft. Before he could invent another lie to save his skin, the heavy boardroom doors swung open a second time. Jasmine and her husband Dion barged into the room. Jasmine was wearing a crisp white blazer, looking perfectly styled and ready to celebrate. I knew exactly why they were here. They had been waiting in Richard's private suite down the hall, fully expecting to take the board of directors out to a lavish lunch the moment Richard finalized the legal theft of my mother's estate. But instead of walking into a room full of applause, they walked into a dead silent boardroom where their entire financial future was hanging by a thread. Dion took one look at Richard, who was still slumped in his leather chair with a face as pale as a ghost, and immediately went on the offensive. Dion crossed the room in 3 large strides. He tried to use his height and his broad shoulders to physically intimidate me, stepping so far into my personal space that I was forced to brace my back against the edge of the glass table. He reached out aggressively and snatched the printed DNA results right out from under my hand, crumpling the edges of the paper in his tight fist. He held the document up in the air and shouted to the entire room that this was a complete forgery. He pointed a finger angrily at my face and claimed I had printed the fake lab results off the internet in my apartment just to extort the family. He puffed out his chest and told me to pack up my garbage lies and get the hell out of the building before he dragged me to the elevator himself. He thought his physical aggression would make me shrink away like a scared child. I did not take a single step back. I did not flinch. I just looked up at him with absolute pity. I told Dion that acting like a hostile thug might work on his country club friends, but it was incredibly foolish to try and physically intimidate a forensic accountant in a room completely full of corporate lawyers. Jasmine quickly realized that Dion's aggressive screaming was making them look unstable in front of the highly conservative board members. She immediately changed her tactics and decided to play the victim. She stepped forward, practically shoving Dion out of the way with fake tears instantly welling up in her eyes. She grabbed the edge of the table, leaned toward the open doorway, and screamed for the executive assistant to call building security immediately. Then she turned her attention to the stunned executives. She put her hand over her heart and began performing the role of the deeply concerned, loving sister who was trying to manage a tragedy. She swept her gaze across the room and told the board members that I was having a severe mental breakdown. She claimed that my mother's sudden death had completely shattered my grip on reality, and that I had been acting erratic and dangerous for months. She told them this fabricated DNA report was just a psychotic delusion born out of my own bitter jealousy. Jasmine spoke with such practiced conviction that it was actually sickening to watch. She pleaded with the senior partners not to listen to a single word I said. She swore to them that I was desperately trying to steal her rightful inheritance and ruin our father's spotless legacy simply because I could not handle the fact that I was the outcast of the family. She even had the audacity to wipe a fake tear from her cheek and tell the executives that she had been trying to get me psychiatric help, but I had refused treatment. She was actively trying to gaslight a room full of powerful people into believing I was completely insane, hoping they would just dismiss my evidence and have me escorted out to avoid a messy public scene. The board members looked back and forth between Jasmine's theatrical sobbing, Dion's aggressive posturing, and my complete absolute stillness. Jasmine was banking heavily on the old, tired stereotype of the hysterical, grieving woman. She thought if she screamed loud enough and cried hard enough, the volume of her voice would successfully drown out the reality of my hard evidence. She also expected Richard to jump in and support her narrative. She kept looking at him, waiting for him to back up her lies and order security to remove me. But Richard could not speak. He just sat there, clutching the arms of his chair, completely paralyzed by the realization that his 35-year-old lie was finally catching up to him. He knew the paper in Dion's hand was real, and he knew that calling the police would only trigger an official investigation that would destroy him. I just let them shout. I let Jasmine cry her fake tears, and I let Dion wave his arms around like a cornered animal. They were complete amateurs, throwing a loud tantrum in a room where only facts mattered. They honestly believed that snatching a piece of paper and throwing wild accusations would magically erase the truth. I waited for them to completely exhaust their little performance before I dropped my next piece of leverage. I waited until Jasmine had completely run out of breath and her fake sobs dwindled into pathetic little hiccups. Dion was still holding the crumpled DNA results like they were some kind of trophy, sneering at me, waiting for security to arrive. I took a slow, deliberate step back from the glass table and smoothed down the front of my blazer. I looked directly at the senior legal partner, who was still standing watching this disaster unfold with wide eyes. I told him he did not need to worry about Dion destroying that particular piece of paper. I calmly announced to the entire boardroom that I had already sent certified notarized copies of the genetic screening results via registered mail to the estate's primary legal counsel. I made sure to mention that I had also forwarded a digital copy directly to the senior partner's secure corporate email address at exactly 9:55 this morning, 5 minutes before I walked through those doors. Jasmine stopped crying instantly. The theatrical mask dropped from her face, replaced by genuine, unfiltered panic. She whipped her head around to look at Richard, desperate for him to fix it, but Richard remained completely silent, staring blankly at the glass table. Then I turned my attention back to Dion. His aggressive posture had already begun to deflate the moment I mentioned the lawyers. I took one step closer to him, locking my eyes onto his. I kept my voice low, conversational, but completely lethal. I told Dion that if he and Jasmine really wanted to call the police and file a report for corporate espionage, I would gladly wait for the officers to arrive. I said it would actually save me a trip downtown. I casually mentioned that while I was organizing my financial files this weekend, I had taken a second look at the company's vendor ledgers from the last 3 quarters. I watched the color drain from Dion's face as I listed the name of his private shell company out loud. I recited the exact dollar amounts of the 3 independent consulting fees his firm had billed to Richard's corporate accounts over the summer, fees for logistics and marketing services that were never actually rendered. I told the entire board of directors that I had found a very interesting paper trail of authorized payments personally signed off by Richard himself, funneling directly into Dion's private accounts to pay off his massive gambling debts. The silence in the room shifted from shock to absolute outrage. Embezzlement was not family drama. It was a federal crime that directly impacted the board members' bottom line. I smiled at Dion, a cold, empty smile. I told him that I had compiled a very thick, very detailed file of this embezzlement evidence, and I promised him that if security walked through those doors, my very next phone call would be to my contacts at the IRS to report a massive coordinated tax fraud scheme involving the CEO and his son-in-law. Dion practically dropped the crumpled DNA paper on the floor. He stepped backwards so fast, he bumped into the edge of a leather chair. The fake tough guy act vanished completely. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. He raised his hands defensively, stammering that there had been a misunderstanding with the accounting software, that it was just a temporary loan, looking desperately at the board members, who were now glaring at him with open hostility. Jasmine looked completely horrified, realizing for the first time that her husband had been stealing from the very company she thought she was about to inherit. I had effectively neutralized both of them in under 2 minutes, without ever raising my voice. I turned my back on Dion and looked back at Richard. He was the architect of this entire nightmare, and he knew his walls were caving in. He had to pivot, and he had to do it immediately if he wanted to survive the board meeting. Richard realized his aggressive tactics had completely failed. The threat of an IRS investigation into his son-in-law was the final nail in the coffin for his credibility. I watched him take a slow, deep breath. Right before my eyes, the arrogant dictator vanished and was replaced by a heartbroken elderly man. It was a terrifyingly smooth transition. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the DNA results from the table. This time, he did not look at the paper with anger. He looked at it with profound, fabricated horror. He covered his mouth with his hand and let out a choked gasp. The board members leaned forward in their chairs, completely captivated by his sudden emotional display. Richard looked up at me with tears welling in his eyes. He shook his head slowly and whispered that this was impossible. Then he widened his eyes as if a sudden realization had just hit him. He slammed his hand against his chest and said it was the hospital. He claimed Atlanta Memorial Hospital must have made a catastrophic error. He started spinning a desperate but highly effective narrative. He told the silent boardroom about the night I was born in 1991. He painted a picture of a chaotic, understaffed maternity ward. He claimed that Clarice had a traumatic delivery, and he was forced to wait out in the hallway for hours while the doctors rushed around. He looked directly at the senior legal partner and suggested that the nurses must have mixed up the identification tags in the nursery. He claimed that a tragic baby switch was the only logical explanation for why I was his biological child, but not his wife's. It was a brilliant pivot. By blaming the hospital, he instantly transformed himself from a deceitful fraud into the ultimate victim of medical malpractice. He stood up from his chair and walked slowly toward me, extending his hands in a gesture of fake surrender. He told me that we had both been robbed of the truth for 35 years. He begged me to put our differences aside so we could investigate Atlanta Memorial Hospital together. He promised the board of directors that he would hire private investigators to find out what really happened that night and to discover if Clarice had a biological child out there somewhere. Jasmine looked incredibly confused by this sudden change in the story, but she kept her mouth shut. Dion was just standing in the corner, wiping the sweat off his forehead, deeply relieved that the focus was no longer on his massive embezzlement scheme. The board members visibly relaxed. They wanted to believe Richard. Blaming a hospital for a mistake made 3 decades ago was a clean corporate narrative that would protect the company's stock from a messy public scandal. As an auditor, I know exactly what it looks like when a guilty person tries to buy time. Richard was trying to control the investigation so he could destroy the evidence before I found it. But I also knew that confronting a liar when they are putting on their best performance rarely works. You have to let them think they have successfully fooled you so they will drop their guard and make their next mistake. I looked at his outstretched hands and then up at his tear-filled eyes. I let my own expression soften just a fraction. I nodded slowly. I told him that an investigation into the hospital was exactly what we needed to do. I agreed to play along and let him lead the charge. The visible wave of relief that washed over his face was almost comical. He truly believed he had manipulated me into backing down and trusting him. I picked up my leather bag from the table and turned my back on him. I began walking toward the heavy frosted glass doors to leave the boardroom. The walls of the executive suite were made of highly polished dark glass, designed to look sleek and modern. As I reached out to grab the door handle, the lighting in the hallway hit the glass at the perfect angle, turning the wall panel into a flawless dark mirror. I did not turn my head, but I shifted my eyes to look at the reflection of the boardroom behind me. The heartbroken elderly man act had instantly vanished the second my back was turned. Richard was not looking at me. He had pulled his smartphone out of his pocket and was holding it hidden below the edge of the glass table. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, ruthless panic. He was typing furiously. Across the room, I saw Dion jump slightly as his phone buzzed in his pocket. Because Richard always kept his phone font incredibly large due to his failing eyesight, I could see the bright white text glaring on his screen in the reflection. It was a single urgent message sent directly to Dion. Fix this before she finds Brenda. Or, I pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the quiet executive hallway, letting the door swing shut behind me. I did not break my stride as I walked toward the elevator. I did not know who Brenda was yet, but I knew exactly where I needed to go to find out. The paper trail was leading straight to Atlanta Memorial Hospital, and the race to get there first had just begun. I pulled out of the underground parking garage and merged onto the busy Atlanta streets. My knuckles were entirely white, gripping the steering wheel. I kept replaying Richard's secret text message in my head. Fix this before she finds Brenda. Brenda had to be a nurse. She had to be the missing link from the night I was born in 1991. If Richard was terrified of me finding her, then Brenda held the exact details of his medical fraud. But I could not just start looking for a first name in a city of millions based on a hunch. I needed the hospital records first. I needed the original paper trail. I arrived at Atlanta Memorial Hospital 30 minutes later. It was a massive, sprawling complex of glass and white concrete. I bypassed the main information desk and followed the blue signs pointing toward the records and administration wing. As a forensic accountant, I know that digital systems can be altered or wiped clean by anyone with enough administrative access and a fat enough paycheck. But physical archives from the early 90s are different. They contain handwritten nurse logs, original carbon copy transfer slips, and actual doctor signatures. Those are the documents that hold the undeniable truth. When people commit fraud, they always try to destroy the physical evidence first, because paper cannot be hacked. I walked into the records department. It was a quiet, brightly lit room with several clerk windows and rows of waiting chairs. I approached the nearest available desk. An older woman with silver hair and reading glasses looked up at me with a polite customer service smile. I placed my driver's license on the counter. I kept my voice steady and professional. I told her I needed to request the full long-form physical birth records and maternal medical logs for a patient named Clarice dated for the exact week of my birth in 1991. I explained that I was the direct next of kin and was executing a legal audit for my late mother's estate. The clerk nodded and began typing my information into her computer system. I stood there tapping my fingernails against the side of my leather bag. My heart was pounding a heavy rhythm in my chest. Every second I stood there felt like an hour. I knew Dion had gotten a head start, but I also knew how slow hospital bureaucracy could be. I prayed the red tape would work in my favor just this once. The clerk stopped typing and frowned. She leaned closer to her monitor and tapped the screen with her pen. She typed something else, hit the enter key, and then looked back up at me with a highly confused expression. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose and told me that she could not fulfill my request. I kept my voice perfectly calm and asked her if there was a problem with my identification. I reminded her that as the legal adult daughter, I had absolute rights to view those files. She shook her head and handed my license back to me. She said it had nothing to do with my identification or my clearance. She looked around the room as if she was afraid someone was listening to us. She lowered her voice and told me that the entire physical archive box containing the maternity ward records for that specific month in 1991 was no longer in the hospital's possession. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I asked her exactly what she meant by that. Hospitals do not just throw away historical patient records without a massive amount of authorized paperwork and strict legal oversight. The clerk looked highly uncomfortable. She nervously arranged the papers on her desk and explained that less than an hour ago, a man claiming to be the primary legal representative for my family's corporate trust had arrived with an emergency judicial order. He had bypassed the front desk entirely and spoken directly to the head of hospital administration. She told me the man had paid a massive expedited processing fee to have those specific physical files permanently destroyed. He claimed the records were part of a sealed adoption proceeding and needed to be incinerated immediately for extreme privacy reasons. My blood turned to absolute ice. Dion. He had not just called someone to ask a favor. He had rushed straight here the second my back was turned in that boardroom. He had used the family's powerful legal connections and Richard's dirty money to completely bypass standard hospital protocol. He knew I was coming for the paper trail, so he decided to burn it to the ground before I could even read it. I leaned against the counter, closing the distance between myself and the clerk. I did not yell or cause a scene. I used the exact authoritative tone I use when I catch a corporate executive lying about their tax returns. I looked her dead in the eye and told her that the man who authorized that destruction was currently under federal investigation for massive corporate embezzlement. I informed her that the files he just pulled contained critical evidence of medical malpractice. I promised her that if she did not tell me exactly where those files were right now, she and the hospital administration would be named as accessories in a multi-million-dollar fraud lawsuit. The clerk went completely pale. Her polite smile vanished instantly. She swallowed hard and leaned forward, whispering frantically. She told me the hospital contracted an independent mobile shredding and incineration company for secure document disposal. She said the secure truck was scheduled to be here this morning for routine commercial pickups. She raised a trembling finger and pointed toward the double doors leading to the back hallway. She told me the man had personally escorted the archive boxes down to the rear loading dock just 15 minutes ago to ensure they were completely destroyed on site. I did not even stay to thank her. I grabbed my bag, turned on my heel, and broke into a full sprint toward the back of the hospital. I pushed through the heavy metal double doors marked for authorized personnel only and found myself in a long concrete service corridor. The polished tiles of the public hospital gave way to scuffed floors and the smell of industrial bleach. I followed the exit signs, running as fast as my heels would allow, until I reached the massive loading bay at the rear of the complex. The deafening roar of a heavy-duty diesel engine hit me before I even stepped outside. I slipped through a side service door and immediately flattened my back against the cold brick wall. The loading dock was a massive concrete platform filled with wooden pallets and commercial dumpsters. Parked right in the center of the bay was a large white truck with a massive industrial shredding unit mounted onto the back. The side of the vehicle proudly advertised secure document destruction and mobile incineration. Standing right next to the roaring mechanical hopper was Dion. He had taken off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, but his expensive designer watch gleamed under the harsh industrial lights. He was pacing nervously, constantly checking his phone and looking over his shoulder toward the hospital doors. Next to him stood a burly contractor wearing a neon yellow safety vest and a faded baseball cap. Between the two men sat a heavy rolling cart stacked high with 4 large dust-covered archive boxes. Even from a distance, I could see the faded red hospital stamps and the bold black numbers labeling them as maternity ward records from 1991. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run out there. I wanted to march across that concrete platform, shove Dion aside, and drag those boxes away from the shredder. I wanted to rip the lids off and find the truth about the woman who actually gave birth to me. But my forensic accountant training kicked in, overpowering my raw emotion. If I ran out there right now, Dion would easily overpower me. The contractor would claim he was just doing his job according to the work order. I would be trespassing, and Dion would walk away without a single scratch on his reputation. I did not need to save the paper to destroy Dion. I needed to document the crime. I reached into my bag and pulled out my smartphone. I ducked behind a tall stack of empty wooden pallets, giving myself a clear, unobstructed line of sight. I opened my camera application, switched it to video mode, and set the resolution to maximum 4K. I hit the red record button and slowly zoomed in. The lens focused perfectly on Dion's face, just as he reached into his trousers and pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. He handed it directly to the contractor. My camera captured every single detail in high definition. I recorded the contractor opening the envelope flap. I recorded his thick fingers pulling out a stack of crisp $100 bills bound with a rubber band. I captured the greedy smile on the contractor's face as he counted the bribe, nodded at Dion, and shoved the envelope deep into his safety vest pocket. With the bribe secured, the contractor turned his attention to the archive boxes. He grabbed the first box, lifted it over his head, and dumped the entire contents into the mechanical hopper. My heart sank as I watched 35 years of medical history, nurse logs, and birth certificates get sucked into the steel teeth of the industrial shredder. The machine roared, chewing through the thick paper in seconds. Dion stood right there, watching the documents turn into absolute confetti, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked incredibly relieved. He genuinely thought he had just burned the only bridge that could lead me to the truth. I kept the camera perfectly steady. I recorded the destruction of the second box, then the third, and finally the fourth. When the rolling cart was completely empty, the contractor hit a button on the side of the truck, sealing the shredding unit. Before stopping the video, I smoothly panned the camera to the right. I zoomed in on the side of the truck, capturing the company logo, the specific fleet vehicle number, and the state license plate mounted on the rear bumper. I had the exact time, the exact location, the faces of both men, the exchange of unreported cash, and the precise moment critical evidence was intentionally destroyed. Dion shook the contractor's hand, grabbed his suit jacket, and began walking briskly toward the visitor parking garage. He was practically skipping, convinced he had just saved Richard's empire and his own lavish lifestyle. I lowered my phone and hit the stop button. I immediately opened my secure cloud drive and uploaded the massive video file to 3 separate encrypted servers. The physical paper trail was gone. The ink signatures from the night I was born were currently sitting in the belly of a shredding truck. But Dion had just handed me a federal felony on a silver platter: destruction of medical records, obstruction of justice, and corporate bribery. When the time came, I was going to play this video for the board of directors and watch his life shatter into tiny pieces. I stepped out from behind the wooden pallets and watched the shredding truck drive away. Dion had successfully burned the paper, but he clearly did not understand how modern medical infrastructure worked. The physical files were gone, but the hospital was a massive entity. In the early 90s, physical records were routinely transcribed into early digital legacy databases for internal billing purposes. I just needed to find the digital footprints that survived the fire. I walked swiftly away from the loading dock and headed straight back to my car in the visitor parking garage. I locked the doors, turned on the engine, and immediately pulled my laptop out of my bag. Dion had burned the medical histories, but as an auditor, I know one universal truth: nobody ever deletes the billing records. In 1991, physical charts were still the primary standard for patient care, but hospitals were already transitioning to early digital systems to process insurance claims. Doctors might lose a file, but the accounting department never loses a receipt. I opened my secure mobile hotspot and made a phone call to a former colleague named Terrence. Terrence and I had worked together at a major accounting firm years ago, and he was currently a senior director in medical billing compliance for the regional hospital network. I did not give him the family drama. I just told him I was working on a highly sensitive corporate fraud case and needed a 10-minute backdoor access window into the hospital's legacy billing mainframe. Terrence hesitated, but he owed me a massive favor from a previous audit where I caught a vendor discrepancy that saved his career. 2 minutes later, he texted me a temporary read-only login credential and an IP address. I connected to the antiquated server. The interface was a clunky black screen with green text, an old database system that had been archived but never fully taken offline. I typed in the exact date of my birth and filtered the search parameters exclusively to the maternity ward. I searched for Clarice's name first. Her billing record popped up instantly. I scrolled through the itemized charges. It showed an extended hospital stay, heavy medication codes, and the use of a private recovery suite. But the billing codes for the actual delivery were strangely categorized under emergency trauma rather than a standard live birth. I frowned at the screen. I needed a baseline comparison. I cleared Clarice's name and broadened the search to include every single patient admitted to the maternity ward during the exact 24-hour window surrounding my birth. The screen populated with a list of 12 women. I sorted them by the exact hour of delivery. 2 names appeared side by side, admitted within minutes of each other, assigned to adjacent private delivery rooms. One was Clarice. The other was a woman named Vanessa Hughes. I stared at the green text blinking on the dark screen. Vanessa Hughes. The name triggered an immediate alarm in my head. I opened a second window on my laptop and logged into the state's corporate registry database. I pulled up the historical employee manifest for Richard's company from the early 90s. I hit the search function and typed in Vanessa's name. The result came back in seconds. Vanessa Hughes was not just a random woman in the hospital. 35 years ago, she was Richard's personal executive assistant. According to the payroll records, she was hired when she was 22 years old, received 3 massive salary bumps in her first year, and then abruptly vanished from the corporate registry completely. Her final paycheck was issued 2 weeks before the date of my birth. My hands started to shake, but I forced myself to keep reading the data. The picture was becoming terrifyingly clear. Richard had gotten his young assistant pregnant. He had hidden her away, and by some massive twist of fate, both his mistress and his wealthy wife had gone into labor on the exact same night, in the exact same hospital. I clicked back over to the hospital billing terminal. I needed to see how the logistics of the cover-up worked. I cross-referenced the itemized billing codes for both Clarice and Vanessa. In hospitals, every single gauze pad, every syringe, and every procedure is digitally tagged with the employee identification number of the attending medical staff. I pulled the staff logs for both rooms. The attending physicians were different, but the primary delivery nurse assigned to both women was exactly the same. An employee identification number ending in 427. I ran that specific number through the hospital's archived payroll registry. The system spit out a name: Nurse Brenda. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with a sickening snap. Richard's secret text message to Dion flashed in my mind again. Fix this before she finds Brenda. Brenda was the delivery nurse floating between the 2 rooms. She was the only medical professional who had unrestricted access to both Clarice and Vanessa during the most chaotic hours of their lives. She was the one who handled the babies, and she was the one Richard had compromised. I closed my laptop and gripped the steering wheel. I now knew the identity of my biological mother. I knew Richard had orchestrated a massive deception right inside the maternity ward. But looking at the cold digital numbers on a screen was not enough to stand up in a court of law. To completely destroy Richard and take back my mother's estate, I needed a sworn confession. I needed the human element. I needed the woman who actually swapped the medical tags to admit what she did on the record. I pulled out my phone and ran a deep background search on Brenda's full name, filtering by her age and previous employment history. I needed to find out where she was hiding before Dion got to her with his corporate lawyers and a briefcase full of hush money. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, staring at the progress bar on my laptop screen. The background check software was scraping through public property records, tax filings, and retirement databases to locate a current address for Brenda. The green bar crept across the screen, agonizingly slow. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, my eyes darting toward the parking garage exit, wondering how much of a head start Dion really had. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of my cell phone shattered the silence inside the car. I picked it up from the center console. The caller ID flashed Jasmine's name. I almost declined it, but my forensic instincts told me to answer. When a fraudster is panicking, they always try to negotiate. I pressed accept and put the phone to my ear. I did not say hello, I just waited. Instead of the shrill insults she had hurled at me all week, I was greeted by the sound of heavy theatrical sobbing. Jasmine was crying so loudly, I had to pull the phone an inch away from my ear. She took a ragged, trembling breath and whispered my name, sounding like a frightened child. She told me that the entire family was falling apart and she could not take the stress anymore. She claimed that Richard was back at the corporate office having a minor panic attack, and Dion was completely overwhelmed by the legal threats I had made in the boardroom. She painted a pathetic picture of a grieving family being torn apart by a tragic misunderstanding. Then she made her move. Her crying magically stopped for just a second, replaced by a smooth, highly rehearsed tone. She told me that we did not need to fight like this. She said that lawyers and private investigators would only drain our mother's estate with endless fees. Jasmine took a deep breath and made her offer. She proposed that we completely bypass Richard's disinheritance petition and the hospital investigation. She promised that if I simply dropped the corporate embezzlement charges against Dion and walked away from the medical records, she would personally guarantee a 50-50 split of the entire family trust. She lowered her voice to a sweet, sickening whisper and told me that we could finally put the past behind us and be a real family. I sat in my car staring blankly through the windshield as her words washed over me. A 50-50 split. She was offering me tens of millions of dollars with a single phone call. In the world of auditing, an unprompted offer to surrender half of your assets is not an olive branch. It is a massive flashing neon sign of profound guilt. Jasmine was the golden child. Just 4 days ago at the funeral reception, she had publicly paraded her designer mourning dress, laughed in my face, and gleefully supported my complete removal from the family tree. She had called me an illegitimate leech in front of 70 people. Jasmine did not want to be a real family. Jasmine was terrified. The realization hit me so hard it almost took my breath away. She knew. Jasmine had known the truth about my parentage, or at least the massive scope of Richard's fraud this entire time. She had happily played along with my mother's gaslighting and my emotional abuse because it guaranteed she would inherit everything. But now Dion had likely called her from the shredding truck and told her about the digital records. Or Richard had warned her that my DNA evidence was airtight and the hospital story was just a stalling tactic. They realized their cover-up was crumbling, so they sent the golden child to buy my silence with half the money. I gripped the phone tightly. I did not yell. I kept my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I told Jasmine that her offer was incredibly generous for someone who had just publicly branded me a bastard. Jasmine stuttered, trying to backpedal. She started crying again, claiming that she was just emotional at the funeral and that she had always loved me deep down. She begged me to just meet her at a coffee shop to sign a private settlement agreement. She told me to stop digging into the past because some secrets were meant to stay buried for the good of everyone. She was trying to protect her luxury cars, her designer clothes, and the country club lifestyle she had built on a foundation of my mother's suffering. She was willing to sell Richard out for half the trust fund just to keep herself out of bankruptcy and her husband out of federal prison. I opened my mouth to tell her exactly what I thought of her pathetic settlement offer. But before I could speak, a sharp metallic chime rang out from my laptop speakers. I looked down at the screen. The background check software progress bar had reached 100%. The database had successfully located a match. A detailed profile populated on the screen. It displayed a recent photograph of an elderly African-American woman with silver hair. Below the picture was a current legal address. Nurse Brenda was alive. She was currently residing at an upscale private assisted living facility in a quiet suburb just 45 minutes outside of the city limits. She was completely stationary and entirely accessible. Jasmine was still talking through the phone speaker, rambling about how we could take a sister's trip to the Bahamas once the paperwork was signed, desperately trying to paint a picture of a future that was never going to happen. I interrupted her mid-sentence. I told Jasmine to keep her 50% because by tomorrow morning I was going to take 100% of the estate and leave her with absolutely nothing. I hit the red button on my phone, cutting off her panicked scream. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, slammed my laptop shut, and threw the car into drive. The paper trail had burned, the digital footprints were secured, and now it was time to collect the human confession. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal and sped out of the hospital parking garage, heading straight for the suburbs. I arrived at the Oak Haven Assisted Living Center just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It was an incredibly upscale facility with manicured lawns, a large stone fountain by the entrance, and security guards patrolling the perimeter. This was not the kind of place a retired hospital nurse could afford on a standard pension. The luxury surrounding me was the physical manifestation of Richard's hush money. He had paid for her comfort to guarantee her silence. I parked my car in the visitor lot and grabbed my leather bag. I did not walk through the main entrance. I knew that if Dion was on his way, he might have already called ahead to warn the staff or restrict visitors. Instead, I walked around the side of the building, blending in with a group of visiting family members who were returning from a garden walk. I slipped through a side patio door that required a keypad code, holding it open just as an orderly walked out. Once inside, I consulted the room number from my background check software. Room 214. I took the stairs to the second floor, bypassing the main reception desk completely. The hallways were bright and smelled faintly of lavender and institutional cleaner. The doors to the resident suites were heavy oak, complete with brass nameplates. I found room 214 at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open without knocking and stepped inside. It was a spacious, sunlit room overlooking the gardens. Sitting in a comfortable recliner by the window was an elderly African-American woman with neat silver hair. She was wearing a soft cardigan and holding a delicate porcelain teacup, looking out at the manicured lawns. Even with the passage of 35 years, I could recognize the structure of her face from the old hospital staff photographs. This was Nurse Brenda. I gently closed the heavy oak door behind me until it latched with a soft click. The sound startled her. She turned her head, her brow furrowing in confusion, when she saw a stranger standing in her room. I did not move closer immediately. I stood by the door, keeping my posture relaxed but commanding. I kept my voice calm and steady. I introduced myself. I told her my name was Rochelle and that I was 35 years old. Brenda nodded politely, clearly waiting for me to explain why I was in her room. Then I dropped the hammer. I told her I was born at Atlanta Memorial Hospital in 1991. I watched her eyes widen slightly at the mention of the hospital. I told her that my mother's name was Clarice, but that a recent DNA test had proven Clarice was not my biological mother. Brenda froze. The teacup in her hands began to rattle slightly against its saucer. I took one step forward. I told her that I knew the truth about the maternity ward. I told her I knew about Vanessa Hughes. And finally, I looked her directly in the eyes and introduced myself as Richard's daughter. The delicate porcelain teacup slipped from Brenda's trembling hands. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp crash, shattering into dozens of pieces and splashing dark tea across her slippers. She did not even look down. She just stared at me with pure, unadulterated terror. The color drained from her face, making her look incredibly fragile. She pressed her hands against her chest as if she was struggling to breathe. She shrank back into her recliner, her whole body shaking violently. She did not try to deny anything. She did not ask me what I was talking about or pretend she had no memory of the event. 35 years of carrying a massive secret had clearly taken a heavy psychological toll on her. When confronted with the living, breathing evidence of her crime, she completely crumbled. She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head back and forth. Her voice was nothing more than a ragged, terrified whisper. She said that he promised her the money would keep her safe. She repeated it twice, clutching the collar of her cardigan, terrified of the consequences she had avoided for over 3 decades. I walked slowly across the room, carefully stepping over the shattered porcelain on the floor. I pulled a small wooden chair away from a desk and positioned it directly in front of her recliner. I sat down, making sure I was at her eye level. I did not raise my voice, but my tone was absolute steel. I told Brenda that Richard was currently under federal investigation for massive corporate fraud and that his legal protections were completely gone. I explained that the hospital archives had just been destroyed by his son-in-law, which meant Richard was currently burning the evidence and severing all ties. I warned her that men like my father do not leave loose ends lying around in expensive assisted living facilities when their freedom is on the line. I told her that Richard could no longer protect her and the money would not save her from federal prison. She opened her eyes and looked at me. The fear in her expression shifted to absolute despair. I reached into my bag and pulled out my smartphone. I told her that she had exactly one chance to save herself from being indicted as a co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar estate fraud scheme. I told her I did not want her money and I did not want to ruin the end of her life. I just wanted the truth. I needed her to tell me exactly what Richard paid her to do on the night I was born. I opened my camera application and placed the phone on the small table next to her, adjusting the lens so it captured her face perfectly. I hit the record button. A small red light blinked on the screen. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the terrified woman who had altered the entire course of my life for a stack of cash. I told her to start from the beginning. I stared at the blinking red light on my phone screen. Brenda kept her eyes locked on it too. She took a deep, shaky breath and began to speak. Her voice was raspy and weak at first, but as she recounted the events of that night in 1991, the memories seemed to pour out of her like a toxic flood she had been holding back for decades. She told me it was the middle of October. A massive storm had knocked out the power in half the city, leaving the hospital running on backup generators. The maternity ward was completely understaffed and highly chaotic. Brenda was the senior delivery nurse on the floor. Around midnight, my mother Clarice was rushed in through the emergency doors in premature labor. Her husband Richard was right beside her, but Brenda noticed he kept leaving the room to make frantic phone calls from the hallway payphone. 2 hours later, another woman was wheeled onto the floor. Vanessa Hughes. Brenda recognized her immediately because Richard completely froze and turned pale when he saw her stretcher roll past Clarice's room. Vanessa was also in active labor, but she was entirely alone. Brenda wiped a tear from her wrinkled cheek and described the absolute nightmare that unfolded over the next 4 hours. Clarice suffered a massive placental abruption. Despite the doctors doing everything they could, the baby did not survive the delivery. Clarice was heavily sedated and unconscious, completely unaware that her child had been stillborn. But the tragedy of that night was not over. Down the hall in the adjacent room, Vanessa was experiencing severe complications of her own. She began to hemorrhage shortly after giving birth to a healthy baby girl. That baby was me. The surgical team fought desperately to stabilize Vanessa, but she coded on the operating table. She died without ever getting the chance to hold me. Brenda told me that when she walked out into the hallway to inform Richard about Vanessa, he did not cry. He did not ask to see the woman who had just died giving birth to his child. Instead, he grabbed Brenda by the arm, pulled her into a sterile supply closet, and locked the door. He was terrified, but not of grief. He was terrified of poverty. Clarice came from immense generational wealth. If she woke up to find her baby dead and then discovered that her husband had a mistress who died giving birth in the exact same hospital on the exact same night, she would have divorced him immediately. She would have stripped him of every single asset and ruined his reputation in high society. He would have been left with absolutely nothing but an orphaned bastard child. So Richard made a business transaction. He looked Brenda dead in the eye and offered her $50,000 in untraceable cash to fix his problem. Brenda sobbed openly as she confessed the exact mechanics of the crime to my phone camera. She told me how she walked into the nursery while the other nurses were distracted by the chaotic storm conditions. She took the medical identification bracelet off the ankle of Clarice's stillborn baby and swapped it with mine. She altered the handwritten nursing logs, falsified the transfer slips, and manipulated the billing codes to cover her tracks. She placed me the healthy affair child into the bassinet designated for Clarice's room. The hospital was in such disarray from the power outages and the double tragedies that no one questioned the senior nurse's paperwork. But the darkest part of Brenda's confession was what Richard did after we went home. I asked her how Richard managed to explain my complete lack of physical resemblance to Clarice's side of the family. Brenda looked at me with immense guilt. She said Richard did not just lie to Clarice, he actively destroyed her mind. When Clarice eventually noticed that I did not share her features, Richard went on the offensive. He aggressively accused her of having a secret affair. He gaslit her relentlessly, twisting her severe postpartum depression into a confession of guilt. He convinced a grieving, emotionally vulnerable woman that she must have blacked out and slept with another man. Over the years, he used my face as constant physical proof of her imaginary sins. He broke her spirit completely. He made her feel so deeply ashamed and so heavily indebted to his fake forgiveness that she signed over full control of her inherited wealth to him, just to keep the peace. He forced her to raise his mistress's baby while simultaneously punishing her for it every single day of her life. I sat in the small wooden chair feeling completely numb. As an auditor, I had uncovered millions of dollars in stolen funds and dismantled complex corporate lies. But I had never encountered a scheme this purely evil. Richard had weaponized two tragedies to steal a fortune and mentally enslave his wife. And he had used my entire existence as his ultimate instrument of torture. Brenda buried her face in her hands, weeping loudly, apologizing over and over again for taking the money. I did not comfort her. I just let the camera capture every single tear. I had the absolute proof I needed to destroy Richard. But as I reached forward to stop the recording, Brenda suddenly lifted her head. She wiped her eyes and told me I needed to keep the camera rolling. She said there was one more thing Richard paid her to keep quiet, and it had to do with Jasmine. My hand hovered over the screen of my smartphone. I did not press the stop button. I kept the camera perfectly focused on Brenda. The elderly woman took a ragged breath and wiped her tear-streaked face with the sleeve of her cardigan. She looked incredibly exhausted, but there was also a profound sense of relief in her eyes. The dam had finally broken, and she was ready to let all the poisonous secrets flow out. Brenda told me that my mother Clarice did not just suffer in silence. The psychological torture Richard inflicted on her completely broke her down over the course of 3 years. Richard relentlessly pounded the idea into Clarice's head that her lack of physical resemblance to me was undeniable proof of her infidelity. He isolated her from her wealthy friends and her extended family, creating a prison of shame where he was her only judge and jury. By the time I was 3 years old, Clarice was desperately looking for a way to save her marriage and prove her loyalty to the man who was systematically destroying her. Brenda explained that Clarice secretly returned to the same hospital network, but this time she went directly to the fertility clinic. She was terrified of Richard leaving her, and she believed that if she could just give him a beautiful child that looked exactly the way he wanted, he would finally forgive her for the imaginary affair. Because Clarice was terrified that her own genetics were somehow flawed, she made a drastic decision. She paid a massive premium to use a highly exclusive anonymous sperm donor. She specifically selected a donor profile with physical traits that would perfectly complement her own, ensuring the resulting baby would look like a flawless biological continuation of her side of the family. That baby was my younger sister, Jasmine. I sat back in my chair completely stunned. Jasmine, the golden child. The sister who had spent her entire life parading around our affluent suburb, acting like she was the pristine, untouchable heir to the family throne. Jasmine, who had stood up at our mother's funeral just days ago and gleefully supported my disinheritance because I was supposedly an illegitimate mistake. She was not Richard's biological daughter either. She was the product of an anonymous donor conceived out of sheer terrified desperation. But Brenda was not finished. The story took an even darker turn. Brenda explained that Richard was a man who obsessively controlled his wife's finances. A few months into Clarice's pregnancy with Jasmine, Richard was auditing Clarice's personal bank statements and discovered the massive unexplained withdrawals she had made to pay the private fertility clinic. He used his corporate connections to intimidate a clerk at the clinic and obtained her confidential medical files. He discovered the truth about the anonymous sperm donor immediately. I asked Brenda why Richard did not just divorce her right then and there. If he had documentary proof that his wealthy wife was carrying another man's child, even an anonymous donor, he could have dragged her through court and demanded a massive settlement. Brenda shook her head slowly. She told me a settlement was not enough for Richard. He did not just want a piece of Clarice's generational wealth. He wanted absolute uncontested control over the entire empire. When Richard confronted Clarice with the fertility clinic receipts, he did not show any mercy. He used the donor conception as the ultimate weapon of blackmail. He told Clarice that she had now betrayed him twice. He threatened to expose her donor's secret to her conservative high society parents. He threatened to publicly humiliate her, divorce her, and take all of the family assets in the ensuing legal battle. Clarice, who had already been gaslit into believing she was a terrible, unfaithful wife, completely collapsed under his threats. To keep his silence, Richard forced Clarice to call her estate lawyers. He made her sign irrevocable trust documents that transferred total executive control of her family's entire fortune directly to him. He weaponized Jasmine's existence to completely strip my mother of her financial independence. From that day forward, Clarice was nothing more than a hostage in her own home, raising two children that were living monuments to her husband's sociopathic manipulation. As a forensic accountant, my mind instantly began to process the massive legal implications of what Brenda had just told me. The puzzle pieces were falling into place with devastating precision. Years ago, Richard had his high-powered attorneys draft a highly specific malicious clause into Clarice's trust fund. He deliberately altered the language to explicitly exclude any heirs who were not of direct bloodline descent. He did that entirely to hurt me. He wanted to make absolutely sure that when Clarice died, he could use my lack of maternal DNA to permanently cut me out of the estate and keep every single penny for himself. But Richard's arrogance had just created his own fatal trap. By legally defining the trust beneficiaries strictly by direct bloodline to exclude illegitimate children, he had inadvertently disqualified his own golden child. Jasmine was legally the product of an anonymous donor, and Richard had full knowledge of that fact when he altered the documents. Because Richard's primary claim to the estate was entirely based on medical fraud and severe emotional coercion, the state's fraud statutes would completely strip him of his beneficiary status. And because Jasmine was not a direct bloodline descendant, she would be disqualified by her own father's spiteful legal trap. I was the only child legally adopted and acknowledged on paper, without any fraudulent intent of my own. I was the only person left standing with a legitimate, untainted claim to the entire fortune. I looked at Brenda through the screen of my phone. She was staring at her hands, trembling as the weight of her confession settled over the quiet room. I told her that she had done the right thing today. I assured her that the video recording was secure and that I was going to use it to finally end the nightmare she had helped start 35 years ago. I reached forward and pressed the red button on my screen, ending the recording. The digital file automatically encrypted and backed up to my secure cloud servers. I had the hospital data, the video of Dion bribing the shredder, and now the ultimate sworn confession. My arsenal was completely full. I stood up from the small wooden chair and smoothed down my blazer. I was just about to ask Brenda if she needed me to call a nurse to clean up the shattered teacup on the floor. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed loudly in the hallway outside. Before I could even turn around, the heavy oak door to room 214 was violently shoved open, slamming hard against the wall. Dion stood in the doorway, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. His designer tie was slightly loosened, and his face was slick with sweat from rushing to the facility. Flanking him on either side were two tall men in immaculate gray suits carrying thick leather briefcases. They had the cold, predatory look of high-priced corporate defense attorneys who were used to burying people in endless paperwork. Dayon did not even look at me at first. He marched straight past me and stopped right in front of Brenda. The elderly woman gasped and pressed her trembling hands over her face, terrified by the sudden violent invasion of her quiet room. Dion reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded, slightly yellowed piece of paper. He shook it aggressively in Brenda's direction. He raised his voice, shouting that he held a legally binding non-disclosure agreement signed by her in October of 1991. He told her she had just violated a strict confidentiality clause with a major corporate entity and that she was about to lose absolutely everything she owned. One of the lawyers stepped forward, unlatching his briefcase on the small desk. In a flat, robotic tone, the lawyer informed Brenda that they were preparing to file an immediate civil lawsuit against her for breach of contract, extortion, and defamation. He casually mentioned that they would seize her retirement pension, freeze her bank accounts, and have her immediately evicted from the assisted living facility by the end of the day. Brenda began to hyperventilate. She looked at me with wide, panicked eyes, pleading for help. She was a frail woman in her 70s, completely unequipped to handle the ruthless intimidation tactics of billionaires and their legal attack dogs. I took a deliberate step forward and placed myself directly between Dion and the terrified nurse. I told Dion to step back before I called facility security and had him removed for assaulting a resident. Dion scoffed loudly. He looked me up and down with absolute contempt. The panic I had seen on his face during the boardroom meeting was completely gone, replaced by a smug, overconfident smirk. He genuinely believed he had beaten me. He thought he had successfully covered Richard's tracks and secured Jasmine's inheritance. He crossed his arms and told me my little investigation was officially over. He leaned in close, lowering his voice so only I could hear. He bragged that I was too late to find the hospital records. He told me the physical archive boxes were gone forever, turned into useless confetti just an hour ago. He smiled, showing all his teeth, completely unaware that I had recorded him paying the cash bribe at the loading dock. Dion took a step back and pointed a commanding finger at my leather bag. He demanded that I hand over my phone immediately. He claimed that I was illegally recording a private conversation without the consent of all parties present, which he loudly declared was a felony in this state. He told me that his lawyers were going to confiscate my device, delete the unauthorized footage, and then file a permanent restraining order against me to keep me away from his family and their former employees. The second lawyer chimed in, stepping up to support Dion. He told me that if I did not surrender the digital device right now, they would contact local law enforcement and have me arrested for corporate espionage and harassment of a senior citizen. They thought they had me completely cornered. They thought I was just an angry, grieving daughter playing detective, easily frightened by legal jargon and the threat of police intervention. I looked at the two lawyers. I asked them if they were officially representing Richard and the family trust in this matter. The first lawyer nodded stiffly, stating they were senior partners retained by the executive board to protect the family assets from fraudulent claims. I could not help but smile. It was a small, cold smile that immediately made Dion's smug expression falter just a fraction. I told the lawyers that it was incredibly convenient that they were here because I actually needed to speak with the senior legal partners regarding a massive fraudulent alteration to my mother's estate. Dion lost his patience. He lunged forward, reaching his hand out to snatch my bag from my shoulder. He yelled that he was done playing games and demanded the phone. I did not back away. I reached onto the small wooden table beside Brenda's recliner and picked up my smartphone. The screen was still glowing brightly. I held the device up between us, but I kept my grip firm. I looked directly into Dion's eyes. I watched the arrogant smirk slowly melt off his face as he noticed the specific application running on my screen. It was not the standard camera recording application. It was a secure encrypted corporate conference call interface used exclusively by high-level financial executives. The call duration timer in the center of the screen read 42 minutes and 15 seconds. That was the exact amount of time I had been sitting in this room. I tapped the screen once, unmuting the microphone. I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice carried to the device. I looked Dion dead in the eye and delivered the final blow. I told him I was not recording this conversation on my local drive. I explained that as a forensic accountant, I always ensure my evidence has an unbreakable chain of custody. I told him I had been live streaming this entire conversation from the moment I walked into the room directly to the primary legal counsel and the independent oversight committee of the family trust. I turned the screen around so Dion and his expensive lawyers could see the active participant list. The names of the most powerful attorneys in Richard's own company were clearly visible, actively listening on the line. They had heard Brenda's complete confession about the baby swap in the maternity ward. They had heard the exact details of Richard's medical fraud. They had heard the revelation that Jasmine was the product of an anonymous sperm donor and legally disqualified from the trust. And most importantly, they had just heard Dion openly admit to destroying physical hospital records while actively trying to intimidate a key witness. I smiled coldly back at him. I told him he was way too late. The color completely drained from Dion's face. His mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. The two aggressive corporate lawyers behind him suddenly looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. They realized instantly that they had just walked right into a federal witness tampering trap live on the record with their own corporate oversight committee. The room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of Brenda quietly crying in her chair. The game was absolutely over, and I had won. 48 hours after the confrontation in Brenda's room, I stood in the grand foyer of my mother's estate. The live stream had sent absolute shockwaves through the corporate hierarchy. The senior legal partners did not hesitate. Within minutes of disconnecting the feed, they had temporarily suspended Richard's executive authority, pending an emergency review, and demanded an immediate gathering of all involved parties. I was the one who dictated the location. I chose the family mansion. I wanted to dismantle Richard's empire inside the very house where he had kept my mother psychologically imprisoned for 35 years. The atmosphere inside the mansion was heavy and suffocating. The grand crystal chandeliers cast a bright light over the formal dining room, illuminating the faces of the most powerful people in my father's orbit. 12 corporate board members, 3 senior estate executors, and a team of high-powered attorneys sat around the massive mahogany table in complete silence. This was the exact same room where Richard and Jasmine had spent decades belittling my achievements and making me feel like an unwelcome guest. Tonight, the power dynamic had completely shifted. At the head of the long table sat Richard. He was wearing his most expensive tailored suit, desperately trying to project the image of the untouchable CEO he had always pretended to be. He sat with his shoulders squared and his chin raised, but the illusion was actively crumbling. His skin was pale and his hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles were bone white. He was a cornered animal trying to look like a lion. To his right sat Jasmine. She wore a pristine designer dress, her makeup flawless, but her eyes burned with absolute venom when she looked at me. She was glaring daggers across the room, her jaw clenched tight. She clutched her luxury handbag against her chest like a shield. She still genuinely believed that her status as the golden child would somehow magically protect her. She thought that because she had grown up swimming in wealth, a generous check, and a stack of non-disclosure agreements could make this entire nightmare disappear. To Richard's left sat Dion. Unlike his wife, Dion fully understood the gravity of the situation. He looked like a man walking directly to the gallows. He was sweating through his expensive dress shirt, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the polished wood of the table. He was absolutely terrified to make eye contact with the board of directors. He knew that the corporate lawyers had already started digging into his shell companies following my live-streamed accusations. The arrogant thug who had tried to physically intimidate me in the boardroom just days ago was entirely gone. I walked into the dining room, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Every single head turned to watch me. I did not pull out a chair. I did not sit down. I walked to the exact opposite end of the long dining table and stood tall, facing my father across the expanse of mahogany. The physical distance between us felt like a battlefield drawn with absolute precision. I placed my leather bag on the table and rested my hands flat against the polished surface. I was perfectly calm. As a forensic accountant, this was the moment I lived for. The moment the numbers added up, the lies collapsed, and the truth became undeniable. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie in a nervous, jerky motion. He attempted to seize control of the narrative one last time, relying on the manipulative charisma that had served him for decades. He forced a patronizing, entirely fake smile and looked around the room at his colleagues. He thanked the board members and the estate executors for coming to his home at such a late hour. He adopted a tone of weary sadness, playing the role of the exhausted patriarch. He called the events of the past few days a highly unfortunate family misunderstanding fueled by grief. He claimed that my mother's sudden passing had caused tempers to flare and imaginations to run wild. He looked directly at the senior legal partner and smoothly suggested that this entire situation had tragically bled into the corporate sphere, but that it was ultimately a private domestic matter that did not require board intervention. Jasmine chimed in immediately, perfectly on cue. She let out a dramatic, condescending sigh and crossed her arms. She looked at the estate executors with a sweet, completely manufactured smile. She stated that my grief had caused me to lash out and manufacture a ridiculous conspiracy to cope with the loss of our mother. She casually suggested that Richard was prepared to offer me a highly generous financial settlement to drop all my claims, allowing everyone to move on from this embarrassing public spectacle. She looked at me with a smug expression, silently daring me to take the money and run. They honestly believed they could still buy their way out of this. They thought the immense wealth Richard had stolen from Clarice was a magical barrier that could deflect absolute recorded facts. They expected me to negotiate. They expected me to name a price for my silence. I let the silence hang in the air for 5 agonizing seconds. I looked at the board members who were staring at Richard with expressions ranging from deep skepticism to outright disgust. They had heard the live stream. They were not buying a single word of this pathetic performance. Then I looked directly at my father. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, clinical precision of an auditor delivering a final verdict. I told Richard that this mansion was no longer his home. I told him that the time for settlements, backroom negotiations, and gaslighting had completely expired the exact moment he handed me that disinheritance petition at my mother's funeral. I told Jasmine that she did not have a single dime to offer me because the money she was trying to use to buy my silence had never actually belonged to her father in the first place. Richard opened his mouth to interrupt me, his face flushing red with sudden anger, but I cut him off immediately. I commanded him to sit down and close his mouth. The sharp authority in my voice echoed through the dining room. Richard flinched, snapping his mouth shut, completely paralyzed by my lack of fear. The board members watched in stunned fascination as the powerful CEO withered under the gaze of the daughter he had abused for 35 years. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of printed documents. I dropped them onto the table with a loud thud that made Dayon jump in his seat. I told the entire room that we were not here to negotiate a family misunderstanding. We were here to execute a legal reckoning. I promised Richard, Jasmine, and Dion that by the time I was finished speaking, they would leave this estate with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. I placed my hand on top of the documents, ready to dismantle their lives piece by piece. I kept my hand firmly planted on the thick stack of legal briefs resting on the polished mahogany table. The dining room was so incredibly quiet that I could hear the subtle hum of the massive crystal chandelier hanging above us. I did not break eye contact with Richard. He was staring at the documents under my hand, a bead of sweat slowly rolling down the side of his face. I reached into my leather bag one final time and pulled out my tablet. I tapped the screen wirelessly, casting my display to the massive smart television mounted on the far wall of the dining room. The screen flickered to life, casting a bright, harsh glow over the elegant room. I pressed play. The high-definition recording filled the screen. Brenda's frail, exhausted face appeared in crisp detail, her silver hair catching the light of her nursing facility room. Her voice, raspy but undeniably clear, echoed out of the surround sound speakers. I stood perfectly still and watched the faces of the board members as Brenda began to describe the massive storm that hit Atlanta in October of 1991. When Brenda mentioned the name Vanessa Hughes, a senior board member sitting near the middle of the table visibly flinched. He was an older gentleman who had been with the company for 40 years. He remembered Vanessa. He remembered the young, vibrant executive assistant who had mysteriously vanished from the corporate registry without a trace. I watched the realization wash over his face, his eyes widening in absolute horror as Brenda explained that Vanessa had died on an operating table, giving birth to Richard's illegitimate child. But the room truly stopped breathing when the video reached the hospital nursery. Brenda tearfully confessed to the entire room exactly how she took the medical identification bracelet off the ankle of Clarice's stillborn baby. She detailed how she accepted a $50,000 cash bribe from Richard to swap the tags, alter the nursing logs, and place his mistress's baby into his wealthy wife's arms. Richard violently lunged forward, his heavy wooden chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He desperately reached across the table, trying to grab my tablet to stop the broadcast. He shouted that it was a deepfake, a fabricated artificial intelligence video, a pathetic, disgusting lie designed to extort him. Before his hand could even touch my device, the senior estate executor stood up and slammed his fist down hard on the table. The loud crack silenced Richard instantly. The executor pointed a shaking finger directly at Richard's face and ordered him to sit down and shut his mouth. The executor's voice dripped with absolute venom. He had known my mother Clarice for 30 years. He had managed her finances, attended her charity galas, and watched her slowly wither away under Richard's control. Richard sank back into his chair, physically shrinking under the hateful glares of his own colleagues. He looked frantically at his corporate lawyers for help, but the attorneys were staring at the screen, completely paralyzed by the massive legal liability unfolding before their eyes. The true devastation set in when Brenda detailed the psychological abuse. Her voice cracked as she explained exactly how Richard had weaponized my existence. She told the silent boardroom how Richard had used my face, my lack of resemblance to Clarice's side of the family, to relentlessly gaslight his grieving wife. She explained how he drove Clarice into a severe depression, convincing her she had committed an imaginary affair, systematically destroying her mind just to force her into signing over her generational wealth. Several board members looked physically sick. One woman covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling in her eyes as she realized the sheer magnitude of the torture Clarice had endured. Jasmine sat frozen in her chair, her mouth slightly open, the arrogant smirk completely wiped from her flawless face. Dion looked like he was going to vomit. The video concluded with Brenda weeping into her hands, apologizing repeatedly to the camera for taking the money. The screen faded to black. The ensuing silence lasted only 3 seconds before absolute chaos erupted. 3 board members stood up simultaneously, shouting across the table at Richard. The woman who had been crying demanded to know if Richard had used corporate funds to pay the hospital bribe. The senior legal partner removed his glasses, rubbing his face in pure disbelief, staring at Richard as if he were looking at a complete stranger. The room was a cacophony of outrage accusations and legal threats. I did not let the shouting match derail my momentum. I needed to execute the final financial blow while the wound was still completely fresh. I picked up the heavy stack of printed legal briefs and began walking around the massive table. I handed a bound copy to the senior estate executor. I handed a copy to the lead corporate attorney, and I systematically dropped a copy in front of every single board member. Finally, I walked right up to Richard. I tossed the last copy directly in front of him. It landed with a heavy smack right next to his trembling hands. I walked back to my position at the end of the table. I raised my voice using the exact commanding tone I use when I testify in federal court. I told everyone to open the briefs to page 1. The shouting immediately died down. The sound of thick paper turning echoed through the room as the executives rushed to read the documents. I explained that what they had just watched was not just a tragic piece of family history or a private domestic dispute. It was a recorded sworn confession to a coordinated multi-million-dollar financial crime. I directed the estate executors to the specific state statutes highlighted in bold on the first page of the brief. I looked directly at the senior estate executor and explained the legal doctrine of fraudulent inducement. I told the room that the state laws regarding inheritance and trust distribution are incredibly clear on this specific matter. A person cannot financially benefit from an estate if they actively committed severe fraud, coercion, or emotional abuse to secure their position as a beneficiary. I explained that it operates under the exact same legal principles as the Slayer rule. I told Richard that just as you cannot murder someone to inherit their life insurance, you cannot medically manipulate and psychologically destroy a woman for 3 decades to steal her trust fund. The law explicitly forbids a criminal from profiting off their own calculated abuse. Richard slammed his hand flat on the table, trying to muster a fraction of his old authority. He shouted that the statute of limitations on a crime committed 35 years ago had completely expired. He looked desperately at his corporate lawyers, begging them to validate his defense. He claimed I had no legal standing to retroactively challenge a trust document that Clarice had willingly signed decades ago. I smiled a cold, unforgiving smile. I looked at his expensive lawyers, waiting for them to correct him. When they remained completely silent, I delivered the lesson myself. I told Richard that he fundamentally misunderstood how fraud statutes operate in probate court. I explained that the statute of limitations for severe financial fraud tolls, meaning the legal clock remains completely paused until the exact moment the victim or the victim's estate formally discovers the deception. Clarice died without ever knowing the truth, which meant the fraud was only legally discovered 2 days ago when the genetic testing laboratory processed my DNA. The legal clock had not expired. It had just started ticking. I turned my attention to the lead corporate attorney. I asked him to publicly verify my assessment of the law for the board of directors. The attorney swallowed hard, looked down at the briefs, and gave a slow, reluctant nod. He told the board that my legal interpretation was entirely accurate. He confirmed that based on the irrefutable video evidence of medical bribery and extortion, Richard's claim to the estate was irreparably corrupted. I looked back at my father. He was staring at the attorney with a look of absolute betrayal. His chest was heaving, his breathing shallow and erratic. I told Richard that because my legal team had already formally filed this evidence and the sworn video confession with the probate court, an hour before this meeting, the legal mechanism had already been triggered. The executors now had a strict fiduciary duty to freeze his access to the trust immediately, or they would face massive personal liability for distributing funds to a perpetrator of fraud. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, and delivered the final verdict. I told him that his status as the primary beneficiary of Clarice's estate was immediately, permanently, and completely revoked. He was legally stripped of everything he had spent 35 years trying to steal. He was not getting the corporate shares, he was not getting the real estate properties, and he was not getting a single dime of my mother's money. Richard collapsed back into his chair as if all the bones in his body had suddenly dissolved. He looked at the legal brief sitting in front of him, his eyes completely hollow. He had spent his entire adult life building a fortress of lies, believing he was the smartest person in any room. He had manipulated his wife, discarded his mistress, and treated his biological daughter like a parasite. And now, in a matter of 20 minutes, a forensic accountant armed with a swab of cotton and a smartphone camera had completely annihilated his empire. Jasmine suddenly pushed her chair back. The harsh scraping sound cut through the heavy silence. She was panicking. With Richard entirely removed from the trust, the massive inheritance she had been banking on to fund her lavish lifestyle and pay off Dion's hidden debts was suddenly floating in legal limbo. She looked at me, her eyes wide with desperate realization. She thought she knew exactly how this was going to play out. She thought that with Richard disqualified, she was the only legitimate heir left to inherit the fortune. She opened her mouth, ready to stake her claim and demand her money. She had absolutely no idea that I had prepared a second legal brief just for her. Jasmine pushed her heavy dining chair back so violently that it tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. The sudden noise echoed like a gunshot through the silent mansion, but Jasmine did not even flinch. She stood up, her chest heaving, her eyes darting between Richard and the senior estate executors. The absolute panic that had gripped her just moments ago was rapidly transforming into something entirely different. It was transforming into pure, unadulterated greed. She looked down at Richard, who was still slumped in his chair, completely broken and staring at nothing. For her entire life, Jasmine had worshipped the ground this man walked on. She had acted as his loyal soldier, happily participating in his campaigns of emotional abuse against me, just to secure her spot as the golden child. But the moment she realized his power was gone, her loyalty vanished instantly. She looked at the man who had raised her with an expression of absolute disgust. She was cutting her losses. Jasmine took a deep breath, smoothed down the front of her pristine designer dress, and turned her attention directly to the senior estate executor. She raised her chin, adopting the arrogant, commanding posture she had spent decades practicing in country club dining rooms. She announced to the entire room that if Richard was legally disqualified from the trust due to his fraudulent actions, then the line of succession was incredibly clear. She pointed a manicured finger at her own chest and declared that she was the sole remaining legitimate heir to the family fortune. She completely ignored the devastating revelation from Brenda regarding her own conception. In her mind, the fact that Clarice was her biological mother was the only thing that mattered. She conveniently pushed aside the detail about the anonymous sperm donor, completely convinced that her status as the favored daughter would somehow magically override the law. Jasmine raised her voice, making sure every board member heard her. She stated that she was Clarice's true flesh and blood, born during the marriage and raised in this very house. She glared across the long mahogany table at me, her eyes burning with a hateful, victorious fire. She pointed that same manicured finger in my direction and told the executors that I had just proven my own illegitimacy. She claimed that by exposing Richard's affair and proving I shared zero maternal DNA with Clarice, I had successfully managed to cut myself out of the will completely. She actually laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that sent a chill through the room. She told me that I was nothing but a pathetic, bitter auditor who had dug her own grave. She thanked me sarcastically for doing the dirty work of removing Richard from the equation, leaving the entire multi-million-dollar empire sitting squarely in her lap. She demanded that the estate executors immediately transfer the deeds to the properties, hand over the corporate voting shares, and grant her full executive control of the trust accounts by the following morning. Dion, who had been sweating through his shirt and staring at the floor in sheer terror, suddenly perked up. The realization that his wife was about to become the sole heir to a massive fortune completely revitalized his arrogant attitude. He stood up next to Jasmine, puffing out his chest, completely ignoring the fact that half the board of directors were currently looking at him like he was a convicted felon. He crossed his arms and looked at me with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. He told me to pack up my little briefcase and get off his property. He claimed the investigation was over, the money was theirs, and if I did not walk out the front door right now, he would have me arrested for trespassing. I stood at the opposite end of the long dining table, perfectly still, letting them enjoy their delusional victory. I let Jasmine outline all the ways she was going to spend my mother's money. I let Dayon puff his chest and pretend he was a powerful man. I waited until the echoes of their arrogant demands completely faded into the high ceilings of the dining room. Then I reached into my leather bag for the very last time. I pulled out a second stack of printed documents. These were not printed on standard white paper. They were bound in thick blue legal covers, stamped with the official seal of the state probate court. I walked slowly around the table, repeating the exact same process I had done minutes before. I handed a copy to the senior estate executor, a copy to the lead corporate attorney, and a copy to every single board member. I walked right past Dion, completely ignoring his empty threats, and dropped a copy directly in front of Jasmine. I told her she might want to sit down and read the fine print before she started redecorating the mansion. I returned to my spot at the head of the table. I instructed the room to open the blue folders to page 14, section 4, paragraph B. I waited as the sound of rustling paper filled the room once again. The senior estate executor adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. I looked directly at Jasmine and explained the history of the document she was holding. I told the room that 10 years ago, when I was 25 years old and just starting my career as an auditor, Richard became incredibly paranoid. He was terrified that if Clarice passed away, I might somehow find a way to claim a portion of the estate through standard probate laws. He hated me so deeply that the mere thought of me inheriting a single dime of the family money kept him awake at night. So Richard hired the most expensive estate attorneys in the city to maliciously alter the foundational language of Clarice's trust. He manipulated his broken, heavily medicated wife into signing a sweeping amendment that completely redefined the qualifications for inheritance. I recited the exact wording of the clause from memory, my voice echoing clearly across the dining room. The trust explicitly states that all assets shall be exclusively distributed only to heirs who share direct unbroken genetic bloodline descent from both Clarice and Richard. Furthermore, the clause explicitly excludes any and all heirs, whether adopted, claimed, or presumed, who cannot legally prove biological parentage from both the maternal and paternal lines. I watched the senior legal partner trace his finger under the exact lines I was reciting. He nodded slowly, his face grim. He knew exactly what that clause meant. I looked at Richard, who was staring at the table with wide, horrified eyes. I told him that it was a brilliant, ironclad legal trap. He had designed it specifically to destroy me. He knew I was the product of his affair with Vanessa Hughes. He knew I had zero maternal DNA from Clarice. By legally mandating that any heir must share a direct genetic bloodline with both parents, he had created an absolute impenetrable barrier to ensure I would be permanently locked out of the estate. It was a masterpiece of spiteful corporate law. But then I turned my attention back to Jasmine. Her eyes were darting frantically across the dense legal paragraphs. The arrogant fire in her expression was flickering, replaced by a creeping cold dread. I asked the board of directors and the estate executors to recall the sworn video testimony they had watched just 5 minutes ago. I reminded them of Brenda's second earth-shattering revelation. Clarice, driven to the brink of insanity by Richard's psychological torture, had gone to a private fertility clinic. She had purchased genetic material from an anonymous sperm donor. I looked Jasmine dead in the eye and delivered the crushing mathematical reality. I told her that she shared 50% of her DNA with Clarice, but she shared absolutely 0% of her DNA with Richard. Therefore, she was not of direct unbroken genetic bloodline descent from both parents. The silence in the dining room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a massive explosion before the dust even begins to settle. Jasmine's hands started to shake. She dropped the blue legal folder onto the table. She shook her head rapidly, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. She looked at Richard, her voice rising to a frantic, high-pitched shriek. She demanded that he fix this. She screamed that she was his daughter, that she was the legitimate child, and that a stupid piece of paper could not just erase her entire life. Richard did not look at her. He could not even lift his head. The ultimate crushing irony of his own hatred had completely paralyzed him. He had spent $10,000 in legal fees to draft a malicious clause specifically designed to ruin my life, and in doing so, he had unknowingly drafted the exact legal instrument that disqualified his golden child. He had built a guillotine for me, and Jasmine had just laid her own head on the block. I turned my focus to the senior estate executor. I asked him to clarify the legal standing of a disqualified heir under these specific trust parameters. The executor cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but bound by his professional duty. He stated that the language of the amendment was remarkably rigid. Because the trust demanded genetic proof of dual parentage, And because the sworn testimony of the delivery nurse confirmed the use of an anonymous donor, Jasmine was unequivocally excluded from inheriting any portion of the trust. Dion backed away from the table, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked at his wife, the woman he had married entirely for her anticipated wealth, and realized she was completely financially worthless. The millions of dollars he needed to pay back his embezzled funds had just vanished into thin air. He ran his trembling hands over his bald head, muttering under his breath, completely detached from reality. Jasmine slammed her fists against the mahogany table. She screamed at me, her voice ragged and raw. She demanded to know who gets the money then. She yelled that if Richard was disqualified for fraud and she was disqualified by the bloodline clause, then the entire estate was just going to be seized by the government. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was disqualified too because I did not share maternal DNA with Clarice. She yelled that if she was not getting a dime, then I was not getting a dime either, and I had just destroyed the family for absolutely nothing. I let her scream. I let her exhaust the very last reserves of her entitlement. When she finally ran out of breath and stood there panting, tears of pure rage streaming down her face, I delivered the final fatal stroke of the audit. I told Jasmine that she was absolutely right about one thing. The specific amendment Richard drafted completely disqualified me from inheriting under the standard terms of the trust. But I told her to turn to page 22 of the legal brief. I explained the concept of a residual default clause. In the highly specific event that all named and qualified beneficiaries are either legally disqualified, deceased, or removed due to fraudulent acts, the state probate court cannot simply seize the assets. The estate must default to the closest legally recognized next of kin, who was not a participant in the fraud that corrupted the document. I looked at the senior legal partner. I asked him who signed my birth certificate in October of 1991. The attorney swallowed hard. He stated that Clarice and Richard both signed the birth certificate legally, claiming me as their child. I asked him if I was a minor when the massive medical fraud was committed, and if I had any knowledge or participation in the illegal baby swap. The attorney shook his head and confirmed I was an infant and completely innocent of the crime. I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had allowed myself all week. I looked at Richard, then at Jasmine, and finally at the board of directors. I explained that because Richard's primary claim was completely voided by the Slayer rule for his horrific medical fraud, he was legally erased from the line of succession. Because Richard's own spiteful, genetically restrictive amendment explicitly disqualified Jasmine, she was legally erased from the line of succession. The trust document essentially collapsed under the weight of Richard's own malice. And when a highly restrictive trust collapses, it defaults back to basic probate law. It defaults to the only person left standing who was legally recognized as a child on paper for 35 years and who committed absolutely zero fraud. It defaults entirely to me. The senior estate executor removed his glasses and placed them on the table. He looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and absolute contempt. He announced to the room that my legal assessment was flawless. The trust amendment Richard had drafted was so incredibly aggressive that it left no room for legal maneuvering. By attempting to completely destroy my future, Richard had accidentally funneled the entirety of Clarice's massive fortune directly into my hands. Jasmine let out a sound that I can only describe as the wail of a dying animal. She grabbed the blue legal folder and threw it across the room. It smashed into a crystal vase on a side table, sending shattered glass cascading onto the expensive Persian rug. She collapsed to her knees on the hardwood floor, sobbing hysterically, burying her face in her hands. She had lost her status, her wealth, and her entire identity in a matter of seconds. Dion did not even try to comfort her. He took 3 steps backward, turned around, and practically ran out of the dining room. He knew the board of directors was going to hand his embezzlement file over to the federal authorities by morning. He was abandoning his wife the exact second she ceased to be profitable. Richard remained in his chair at the head of the table. He looked like a corpse that had just been propped up for a viewing. The man who had spent 3 decades terrorizing my mother and calling me a mistake was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his defeat. He looked down the length of the long mahogany table at me. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I packed my tablet back into my leather bag and zipped it shut. I looked at the board members and the estate executors, thanking them for their time and their swift cooperation. I picked up my bag, turned my back on the weeping golden child and the shattered patriarch, and walked out of the dining room. I left them surrounded by the shattered pieces of the empire they had stolen, an empire that now legally and rightfully belonged entirely to me. I reached the heavy double doors of the dining room and placed my hand on the brass handle, fully intending to walk away and let the executives handle the cleanup. But before I could push the door open, the sheer volume of the chaos erupting behind me forced me to stop and turn around. The dominoes I had carefully lined up were finally falling, and the resulting crash was absolutely spectacular. Dion, who had practically sprinted out of the room just moments ago, suddenly stormed back through the side entrance. The terrifying reality of his situation had finally pierced through his panic. He realized he could not simply run away from a massive federal embezzlement charge. The corporate lawyers had his shell company records, and the IRS would be freezing his bank accounts by morning. He needed a scapegoat, and he immediately chose his own wife. He marched directly up to Jasmine, who was still kneeling on the floor, sobbing over the shattered crystal vase. He did not offer his hand to help her up. Instead, he stood over her and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He pointed an accusatory finger at her tear-stained face and viciously blamed her for everything. He yelled about the hundreds of thousands of dollars she had racked up in credit card debt to maintain her country club image. He screamed about her designer clothes, the luxury cars she demanded, and the lavish vacations she forced him to finance. He told the entire room that the only reason he had siphoned money from the company was to pay for her pathetic, endless vanity. Jasmine stopped crying and stared up at the man she had married. The illusion of their perfect golden relationship shattered into a million pieces. She scrambled to her feet, her face twisting into a mask of pure hatred, and screamed right back at him. She called him a weak, incompetent failure. She yelled that he had ruined her life with his gambling debts and his stupid, sloppy accounting. The golden couple who had spent years looking down on me and mocking my independence were now violently tearing each other to shreds in front of the very people they used to desperately impress. While the two of them engaged in a vicious screaming match, the adults in the room took swift surgical action. The senior board member and the lead corporate attorney completely ignored the bickering couple. They stood up and walked over to Richard, who was still paralyzed in his chair at the head of the table. The attorney reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. He placed it face down on the mahogany table and slid it directly over Richard's folded hands. The attorney did not yell. He spoke with the cold, detached precision of a corporate executioner. He informed Richard that the executive board had held an emergency proxy vote an hour before this meeting, contingent entirely on the evidence I was scheduled to present. The attorney officially notified Richard that his employment was terminated, effective immediately. He cited gross misconduct, embezzlement, negligence, and the catastrophic public relations nightmare that would inevitably follow the exposure of his medical fraud and hospital bribery. The senior board member leaned over the table, looking at the man he had once called a friend. He told Richard that the company was severing all ties with him to protect the stock price. He demanded that Richard hand over his corporate security badge, his company-issued phone, and the keys to the executive suites. He coldly advised Richard to retain independent criminal defense counsel, because the corporation would not be protecting him from the incoming federal probes. Richard slowly looked up from the termination notice. He was completely stripped of his title, his company, his stolen wealth, and his reputation. He turned his head and saw me standing by the dining room doors, calmly watching his empire burn to the ground. Something inside him finally snapped. The arrogant patriarch completely evaporated. He scrambled awkwardly out of his heavy wooden chair. His knees buckled and he literally fell to the hardwood floor. He crawled a few paces toward me, reaching out with trembling, desperate hands. Tears streamed down his pale, wrinkled face. He looked up at me with wide, pathetic eyes and began to beg. He begged for mercy. He cried that I could not do this to him. He pleaded with me to remember that he was an old man, that he had nothing left, and that the stress of a criminal trial would kill him. Then, in a final, sickening act of manipulation, he tried to use the very biology he had weaponized against me for 3 decades. He hit his chest and cried out that I was his real flesh and blood. He begged his biological daughter to save him from ruin. I looked down at the weeping, broken man on the floor. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. I did not feel sadness. I just felt utter, profound revulsion. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single syllable hit him like a physical blow. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that he had called me a mistake for 35 years. I reminded him that he had treated my very existence as a stain on his perfect life. I took one step closer to him, towering over his kneeling form, and delivered my final judgment. I told him that leaving me alive to uncover his lies was the only real mistake he ever made. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and pressed a single button on my speed dial. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy front doors of the mansion swung open. The private estate security team, whom the executors had already briefed on the immediate transfer of property ownership, marched into the grand foyer. I pointed at the 3 people who had made my life a living hell. I instructed the head of security to escort Richard, Jasmine, and Dion off my property immediately. I explicitly ordered the guards to supervise them while they packed only their basic personal clothing. I stated clearly that no jewelry, no expensive art, no luxury watches, and no high-end electronics were to leave the premises, as those items were purchased with stolen trust funds and now legally belonged to my estate. I stood in the foyer and watched the guards physically haul them out of the dining room. Jasmine was sobbing uncontrollably, her makeup completely ruined, begging the guards not to touch her. Dion was shouting empty legal threats that no one in the room cared about. Richard did not say another word. He just stared at the floor, a hollow, empty shell of a man, as 2 security guards grabbed him by the arms and marched him toward the door. The heavy oak front doors slammed shut behind them. The loud thud echoed through the grand foyer, followed by the most beautiful, profound silence I had ever experienced in my entire life. 6 months have passed since that night. The justice system moves slowly, but it moves with absolute certainty. Dayon was indicted on multiple counts of corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. He is currently awaiting trial and facing up to 10 years in federal prison. Jasmine filed for a messy, highly publicized divorce to distance herself from his crimes, but she was left with absolutely nothing. The last I heard, the former golden child was working a minimum-wage retail job, living in a tiny studio apartment, and completely cut off from the wealthy social circles that once defined her entire existence. As for Richard, the corporate board aggressively sued him to recoup the stolen funds. He is currently living in a cheap rental property on the outskirts of the city, drowning in legal fees and fighting multiple criminal probes regarding the hospital bribery and medical fraud. He is entirely alone, surrounded only by the consequences of his own sociopathic greed. I am standing on the massive stone balcony of my estate, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The evening air is cool and refreshing. I am holding a glass of expensive red wine, looking out over the manicured lawns that finally belong to me. But I did not just keep the fortune to live in quiet luxury. I took control of the wealth and gave it a true purpose. Last month, I officially launched the Clarice Foundation. It is a fully funded, comprehensive legal clinic dedicated entirely to supporting victims of domestic gaslighting, financial abuse, and medical fraud. I hired a team of ruthless attorneys and forensic accountants who provide free services to people whose families have tried to destroy them. I took the profound suffering my mother endured in this very house and transformed it into a powerful weapon to protect others. I take a slow sip of my wine, feeling the quiet strength radiating through my bones. I am no longer the scapegoat. I am no longer the outcast. I am finally free. I am in total control of my destiny, and I am exactly where I was always meant to be. If you have ever had to burn down a toxic family tree just to plant your own roots, I want to hear your story. Let me know how you reclaimed your power in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that the truth always comes with a heavy price, but the freedom it buys is worth every single penny. Thank you for watching, and remember, you are never required to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm.